The Army's senior leadership at this time seemed content to consider the behavior as a couple of rogue soldiers for which they could have no warning. It was just one of those things, was the early indication as I started some of my research. But there was far more to the story than that. It was not just one of those things. As I studied the unit, I kept coming back to the deployment's chain of events and a concept known in aviation circles as the error chain. And so, as you prepare to take your first junior leadership positions within the Navy, I ask that you never stop looking for places where you can be the one to break the error chain. And I have a couple of suggestions and a couple of areas on how you might do that. Number one, be very suspicious of all the flattery that's heaped upon you and do not believe your own PR. After 3 years of speaking to military leaders of literally every possible rank who were involved what could charitably be described as a less than wholly successful deployment, I didn't meet a single officer who told me that they were bad at their job during that deployment or had been promoted beyond their capabilities. Truly the most enlightened leaders that I met out of this experience were those who acknowledged their share of the responsibility, attempted to learn something from it, and incorporated those lessons back into their life moving forward. So always be self-critical and always be on guard of being overly full of yourselves. Number two, do not fall for cliches and do not mistake talking about leadership as actually leading. This unit's battalion commander from Black Hearts and his staff had a full assortment of slogans and axioms about leadership that they espoused almost endlessly. They talked incessantly about engaged leadership, about how important it was to teach, coach, mentor, that their soldiers, how they always advocated that their soldiers do the harder right versus the easier wrong. They had these things at the tip of their tongue all the time. But when it mattered most, they almost never practiced what they preached. As 1st Platoon degraded before their very eyes, they were either unable or unwilling to acknowledge just how impaired 1st Platoon had become. So all the maxims and slogans that the military throws around are great if they serve to remind you to do the right thing at the right time. But they do run the risk of becoming meaningless boilerplate and lulling into thinking that if you've said the words, then you've done the deed. Number three, when faced with dysfunction, diagnose, do not belittle. Once it became overwhelmingly obvious that 1st Platoon was underperforming, this unit's leadership did not attempt to systematically assess and diagnose the situation, apply correctives, and monitor further progress. Instead, they turned on the platoon. They belittled its incapacity, telling them that they were wallowing in self-pity and blaming its platoon-level leadership for all of its problems. Rather than helping the situation, this response actually exacerbated it. Turning on the platoon heightened its feelings of isolation and persecution and contributed to an even more rapid downward plunge. Number four, take in far more data than you give out. You guys need to learn to heed the trouble signs of a unit in trouble. All of the following should alert you that your subordinates require a second or a third or even a fourth look. Are your people giving you incomplete information? Is the information ambiguous? Are there discrepancies with what they are telling you and what you know to be true from other sources? Are your people distracted, confused, or anxious for any overly long period of time? Likewise, are they demonstrating persistent anti-authoritative streaks? Are they acting impulsively? Are they taking on an air of invulnerability? Or, conversely, are they acting with an air of resignation or futility? The units I examined and wrote about exhibited every single one of these behaviors, and in almost every instance, leaders found a way to rationalize away what they were hearing. All of those kind of data points were pushed away as irrelevant or not important, but they were hugely important. They were warning signs that the unit was in trouble. Number five, you have to speak up. The military is not a culture that tolerates the answer no or we can't. a commander could and arguably should remove that person on the spot. Either you do it or I'll find someone who can is the default military response to someone who even begins to say no to a direct lawful order. But there's far more to this issue than just direct lawful orders. And that is the gray area that I imagine will be most challenging to you as a military officer. Quote, "Nobody would stand up, and the people who do stand up got squashed. The problem clearly had to do with lack of manpower. But there's a culture in the military of just keeping your mouth shut and for some reason saying you can do stuff even when you can't. And when people underneath see people who would try to speak truth to power getting crushed, it showed them that speaking the truth didn't pay. So what that means is that you have people at the top are getting bad feedback. You can get reports that XYZ is fine when XYZ is not fine. In fact, XYZ is the opposite of fine. It's not that that one little piece of information is going to lose the war, but when you see the cumulative effect of information becoming distorted or washed in order to tell a story that a commander wants to tell their hires, then you got real problems. That's the sinister side of it. Number 5, figure out your values, cultivate humility, and communicate. Leaders often fail because they don't actually stand for anything other than the existing power structure itself. So I would say to you right now, even though you are already within the structure of the military, you do have several years to make sure that your individual moral compass is set and honed, to define the things that are most important to you. And while you can course correct for the rest of your life, if you don't have a working foundation before you leave here and are not able to communicate it in your daily life and your work, when it really matters, your subordinates just might fail you because thanks to you, they won't know what right looks like. Number 6, lead from the front. Do not subject your subordinates to dangers or hardships that you are not willing to take yourself. I cannot stress this one highly enough, and this, I think, is one of the root causes that 1st Platoon fell apart. Go where the conditions are the worst. And this advice need not apply just to ground combat. Whatever position, whatever branch you are in, find the toughest, most dangerous, most thankless job in your unit and go do it with them for a little while. Anywhere you are, on a base, on a ship, on a plane, walk around and feel what other people are feeling. Nothing is more important than the morale of a unit, and it is utterly dependent on leadership. The thing that separates those units from this one was the leadership that from the top down set the tone that allowed the unit to unravel. And there were many, many links in the error chain along the way that could have been broken but weren't. And so if I have one parting word of advice, one takeaway that I think will serve you well as you finish your studies here and take your first officer positions, just remember, if a catastrophe is beginning to unfold in your unit, and even though you will only start out as junior officers, you almost certainly have the power to break an error chain. The only question is, will you recognize what's at stake, and will you act on it?